Welcome to this joint meeting on the future of the BBC World Service, and today we're bringing together work from the end of the last Parliament, which was done by the International Development Committee, the evidence sessions from the Culture, Media and Sport Committee, which I chair, and from the Foreign Affairs Committee that Emily chairs, all of which was taken place over the last month or so. And we've all been looking at the role of the BBC World Service and its future funding. Now we're joined by a buffet of different committee members. We have 4 members from each committee or thereabouts. I know all our members would love to have taken part if we'd have had a room big enough in this building to fit us all in and the time to do it, but we're going to try and cover as much as we can in a limited time today. So for our first panel, we're joined by Tim Davie, the Director General of the BBC, and Jonathan Munro, the Global Director and Deputy CEO at BBC News. You're both very welcome. And before we begin, can I remind members to declare any relevant interests before they ask their questions? So I'm going to kick off the questions, and I want to start with you, please, Mr. Davie. Does the £32.5 million uplift awarded from the FCDO for 2025-2026 mean that the World Service is now protected from having to make any savings in the next financial year?
The short answer is no. What it does protect the World Service from is the cutting of any language service in the round. What it will mean though, is it will still mean that we have to look to make some savings within our overall budgets to cope with huge inflationary pressures and the other choices we have to make. So it's not, the good news is, and we're very, very grateful for the money, it was very important to get, it has safeguarded the fact that every language service is preserved, which is great news. What it doesn't do is mean that in every nook and cranny we're going to preserve every element of everything, as it were. And we have to constantly look for savings.
What would the amount have been if you were to have been able to protect all your nooks and crannies?
We didn't get all we asked for. We asked for over 150 million, and we got, we're now at 137 all in, so we would have wanted about 20 million more.
Okay, and then what are you thinking about in terms of the period for the next spending review up to 2028?
Well, what am I thinking about? I suppose, Chair, that acts at a number of levels, if I may. One is there's the minimum rations we need to keep the service reach and viability at this point. And I think the minimum, and my colleague Miss Munro might want to come in on this at some point, but the minimum is to ensure that we continue with this investment. One of the issues I'm sure we'll touch in this committee is one thing that's very difficult is living on a year-by-year variable budget. I mean, anyone who's run any organisation knows there is a massive, it's one of the good things about, dare I say, the licence fee, which is we have a 5-year time frame, and it means we can deliver big changes and efficiencies. With the World Service, the minimum we need, Chair, directly, is that we continue the investment we've got to, hang on in there. We can then open up, I'm sure we'll get to it, a bigger discussion, which is the money we really need to grow the service and invest in the service. That's a different question. My view is that couldn't happen soon enough. So when you say next year, I would think there's a minimum viable investment, but there's also a choice for us all, which is whether we want to grow this service and ensure its competitiveness in what is a ferociously competitive landscape, in which I fear that the jeopardy for the UK and its reputation is quite significant. What
are we talking about financially for your minimum and your optimum requests there?
Well, in terms of, we've currently got, we put in 260 million, the government puts in 137 million for this year. If we continue with that investment, we know what we get. We cling on, we try and keep our reach flat, and that is worth having because it's over 400 million people, we're the most trusted service, etc. I think we're doing the work at the moment, if I may, which I can't answer because it is a bit of what I might call pay and play, which is how much you invest. You can in this market begin to think about what your ambitions are, and in terms of growing, I would love to see an ambitious growth plan for the World Service in which we're trying to really significantly grow the reach and the impact of the service. But and that would mean, as I say, we're delivering, I think, versus others, our efficiency rate is good. we have an investment of around 400 million and we deliver 450 million reach, yeah? So that conversion is quite straightforward. Now, we've talked in the past about, could we double that? I mean, I would love to see 1 in 10 of the world's population getting the most trusted news service. I think the accretive effects for the UK would be very significant, but you're talking about a very significant increase in the budget. In my view, it would be very wise money to spend for the UK, but that's something that we're going to have to discuss, and obviously is in your hands more than mine.
To cut to the chase then, are we saying that the 137 million that you got this year would be enough annually moving forward to keep everything ticking over?
It depends what you call ticking over, Chair, if I may. What it would protect, we've said that at that investment level, assume an inflation rate that, because we have a lot of markets, by the way, globally, that are inflating at 30 or 40%. So I cannot make guarantees, but if we continue to get a sensible inflation rate, that kind of investment, you're at what I'd call the minimum viable spending. You may want to opine on this.
By all means, yeah. Thank you. I think the short answer to your question is that stability of budgets at current level will lead to decline in the World Service. And that's for a number of reasons. The first is that other state actors are spending at an extraordinary rate, and they are eating our lunch, as it were. We pulled out of Lebanon relatively recently, a couple of years ago, with our Arabic radio service, and the Russians moved in pretty much straight away. And the rate of spend of those state actors is eye-watering. We think Russia and China combined are spending about £8 billion a year. We're spending, as we just discussed, about 400 million. So we need to invest in order to grow. We need to invest, frankly, in order to stay still. And the rate of settlement, which, as Tim says, we were really grateful for the FCDO's flexibility, and we had a very good engagement with them about the funding round. It is a one-year settlement. It's not enough to maintain growth in the World Service in the longer run.
Okay, thank you. And then just finally, when it comes to negotiation with the government over the spending review on this, how does that then interact with your request that the responsibility for the World Service passes back to the central government?
I think members of the committees will be aware that until the 2010s, the government funded the World Service in its entirety and had done for 80 years. So there's absolutely a precedent for working with full government funding but total editorial independence. And I think what all of us would agree on is that there's a red line here. Editorial independence needs to be guaranteed and baked in to the BBC without political interference. But the benefits of the World Service are benefits to the UK, not just to the BBC, though of course there are big benefits to BBC audiences. So our view is that full return to government spending will allow the World Service to have a stable budget over time. It will allow us to invest and grow, to adapt our strategic priorities, and to deliver real value for the taxpayer as well as the licence fee payer.
I expect my colleague John Whittingdale will want to ask you a few questions about this later. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Laura, please.
Thank you. And a question to Mr. Munro. Can you explain, given the resource pressures that we're discussing, can you explain how the World Service decides on the allocation of the funding across your different services and regions and programmes?
Yes, by all means. Well, first of all, it's a fluid allocation. It's not set in stone. We move money around from time to time. We've just, for example, started in the last few days an emergency radio service for Syria. Assad fell on Sunday morning, UK time. By Friday morning, we had a radio service for 8 hours a day on medium wave. Tomorrow, it also goes on to FM. So that requires the movement of money, and therefore there's a flexibility around the way we allocate our expenditure. But broadly speaking, we're looking at a matrix of factors. Reach is key. How many millions of people are we reaching per service? So the value for reach is tagged. We know how much each pound returns in terms of reach per service. The platforms are more or less expensive depending on which platform you're talking about. Television is an expensive medium to operate in. It requires a lot of technical infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, studios, etc. Digital is, relatively speaking, much cheaper. Some parts of the world have a real maturity about their digital penetration. People can get digital media pretty easily in some parts of the world. But in other parts of the world, it's really at its infancy and is not moving very fast. And of course, into that mix, you add tricky situations where digital maturity appears to be relatively well established, but conflict or instability breaks out and it's no longer the case. Gaza being a really good case in point. Nobody's sitting in the rubble of Gaza on a smartphone waiting for a data package. That's just not the way they're ingesting news right now. So we move money around according to all those priorities. There are some parts of the World Service portfolio which will always be big beasts of expenditure because they're big beasts of reach. And that would apply, for example, to World Service English, the thing that probably is the most high-profile, best-known product that we make.
Great.
I just want the other factor we'd look at within that, and it's multivariable. It's not like a profit and loss where we just make... Reach is one of the biggest variables. There's also this idea of democratic deficit. Where is this service going to add most value? And that often aligns with the UK's security interests, but we're not a vehicle of government in that way. But it is appropriate that we're looking at where there's a shortage of trusted information, where there are market failures of that nature. So obviously that shapes our thinking in terms of how we deploy and what the most valuable reach is for the World Service. So the conversation I'm having is also not just chasing reach at all costs, but the right reach.
And of course, reach is significant, but there's also incredible diversity within those audiences that you're serving. Do you think that your resources are currently distributed effectively in a way that meets those very diverse needs of the audience?
Well, that's a very fair question. I think they're distributed as effectively as they can be on the resource base, subject to the flexibility we've just discussed, and I think that's important. So, to take a recent example, we redistributed the way we spend money on audiences in Afghanistan because we couldn't any longer stay in Kabul. It's just not possible. And one of our priorities now is reaching girls and young women who do not have an education in Afghanistan. And we make specific output for them in the Afghan languages. That's based in London for safety reasons and resilience reasons. That's a cost we didn't have 3 or 4 years ago. So I do think it's important for all of us not to get too locked into patterns of expenditure, but to remain fleet of foot. None of us know what the world will look like in a few years from now. And as I just mentioned in response to a previous question, we do have a variable rate of competition from, for example, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians. We need to react to that because audiences of need are absolutely on the radar screens of those capital cities to try and get their version of news, which frankly we would recognise more as propaganda, into those markets. And our job is to be there for those audiences.
Perhaps with that competition point in mind, what could the World Service do better to meet, could do better in terms of its allocations to be competitive?
Allocating the existing money?
Yes,
or,
with what you have.
We look all the time at whether we are allocating funds correctly. We had you may remember that we had an injection of cash in 2016-2017 for an expansion programme which was funded by the Foreign Office. And at that time we increased the number of languages that we were providing. We sprung up new languages. For example, several new languages in West Africa covering populations in Nigeria. So all of that money that comes into the World Service is calibrated carefully against what the need of the moment is. It's very important that that is seen in the context of the moment that we're dealing with as opposed to necessarily a long-term commitment, though as we've mentioned we're not planning on closing any languages at all in the foreseeable future, and I think that's right given the portfolio of languages we've got.
There's a particular tension here, which is I think we've done a hell of a lot of work on what I'd call core efficiency, and I'd welcome anyone from the committee to go and visit any World Service output or station and say, can we cut fat? I think in the BBC we've done a lot of work on that. So I don't think you're looking there. Therefore, you're looking at, and we do have these debates in the round. There's some peculiarly tough things going on here, which is not me special pleading, but it's just a market. You're transitioning to digital. Therefore, you have this complexity of linear services. Welcome to my life in the wider job. You've got an all traditional media organisations. You've got significant audiences in linear. Meanwhile, if you're not building new digital services, you've got a problem. The second is rampant inflation plus competitive forces driving up pricing of slots, distribution slots. So there's quite a nexus of things going on. Final thing is, as we know, and many people around this table know, closing services, we don't do a lot of bad work. We may have things we can improve, but if you close off a service, that's going to hurt. So moving money around is probably quite hard for us in that regard. That's the tension. But we are looking at it quite, I think, objectively against our criteria to do that.
Monica.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? just diving into the detail of you moving money to Syria, as you said, where did that money come from? And also, as you're seeing more and more conflicts, there's 120 armed conflicts in the world at the moment, are you finding that you're putting more money into that space?
Yeah. We retain a relatively small flex fund for emergency response, and broadly speaking, it's funding about 3 or 4 things at the moment. It's funding a daily bulletin for Gaza, another one for Sudan, and now the Syria operation, and it did fund the Afghan education program I mentioned a few moments ago. But we will move money around within the portfolio. That happens quite regularly, where we will decide that we are going to prioritise a service or a subject matter or a location around the world in order to deliver against a certain need and take some savings in other areas. So, for example, we have had a strategy in the last few years of offshoring a lot of our production. That's because you're closer to the market, but it's actually also a cheaper way of operating. So, for example, all of our Asian language services are now based out of Bangkok, whereas some of them were previously based in London. That's a better business model. It helps us to release some of our expenditure. And that's good housekeeping as well. That's absolutely not anything more than we should be doing to make sure the public money, whether it's licence fee or government money, goes further. That gives us a little bit of a reservoir to react as quickly as we can to the crises that emerge.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alice.
Thanks very much. Just moving on to kind of longer term funding, which you've obviously touched on. The budget was obviously additional funding for 2025, 2026. Can you expand on long-term plans in progress to secure the World Service's financial future?
Yes, members of the committees will be aware that we have a Royal Charter coming up in just over a couple of years' time. Between now and then, the debate we're very keen to engage in is the level and extent of central government funding for all of the World Service operations, which, as we've just mentioned, is in round figures is about a £400 million turnover business or thereabouts. As you've just heard, we increased our share from Foreign Office funding in the negotiations with the new government just before the Chancellor's budget in October. We would like to see 2 things being true. First of all, the share of the existing funding envelope being increasingly weighted towards central government and decreasingly a licence fee issue, and secondly, to move ultimately to a full funding of the World Service by the government. That clearly needs some protection written into the constitutional governance of that around editorial independence, which we discussed earlier, and also about the way that settlement would behave in the years ahead, relevant to cost prices, inflation, global inflation, etc. Now, whether that's a charter moment or a pre-charter moment, we're open to a constructive discussion with government about, but we've signalled that to government. We think that is the right way forward, and we would like to accelerate that as quickly as we reasonably can. We all recognise, however, that the government has significant demands on its spending. That's the story we report on our news bulletins all the time, and therefore we go into that with a very strong case, but equally we believe we're going in with a powerful incentive for the UK to be a major player in global media at a time when most other major players, not all, but most, are pushing misinformation and disinformation to the audiences we are trying to reach. And that's a really critical point, not just for the BBC, but for the UK as a whole.
I think we'll come back to that subject later. Just in terms of, you've touched on this a little bit, in terms of the additional funding that you've got, is the current focus really on sustaining the World Service's current activities, or are their plans for future development programming? Are you able to look at what extra money would mean?
Yes, I mean, with any business, you need to find a little bit of margin at the top end of a budget to invest in things that are new, because stagnation is obviously the route to decline. The big issue that we are grappling with as a corporation, and it's certainly true within the World Service, is the role that AI might play in future provision of services. It's perfectly possible, for example, to envisage language services being launched in languages we don't currently cover. We currently have 42 language services. It's perfectly possible to envisage over time that growing quite significantly, and with technology allowing us to spread our journalism more prolifically around parts of the world where that's not readily available other than in English. And we're certainly looking at that proactively now. I don't think that's a big leap moment. I think we want to tread relatively carefully. The reputation of the BBC is sacrosanct, and we need to make sure that when we move into that field, we're learning lessons as we go along and we're adapting our model and we're taking adapted and learnt lessons into the next market and then the next one. So that might take some considerable time, but I suspect if we're sitting here in, let's say, 5 years from now, we'll have a rather different portfolio, and that will be largely generated on the investment we need to make now.
I think I'd like to just say something on this. I think that what we've currently got is a funding settlement that directly to your question, gives us some flexibility in the margins to begin digital transition and do some work and bring that. But we don't want to close. You can't close off the linear services, because they're the things that often in many markets are what's underpinning our reach. So I talked about digital transition, and it relates to the chair's opening remarks, which is the first thing is we have a number of challenges. We have a skinny funding settlement. We're very grateful for the money, but we have a skinny funding settlement based on the competitive environment. I mean, this is all tiny versus what we're seeing from the other actors in this space. I mean, the US is a multiple, China multiple, we see Turkey coming in. Now, what that enables us to do, to the chair's initial questions, is hang on in there with language services, but it is essentially a managed decline, or at very best Klingon strategy. And that's, something, and we can do it. The question for us, and I think there's two issues in the long term. One is the principle of funding, and the second is the quantum. On the principle of funding, even at the current level, I do not believe it's correct, and most of our history this was not the case, that the UK licence fee payer through the licence fee should be paying for language services, and the English World Service internationally. That, I think, is wrong. The second thing is the quantum. Then that is a strategic discussion which we can't resolve in a month. But it's really important for us to decide, as the UK, what is our strategic plan, and is it one of growth and extended influence and competitiveness? To do that, again, to the top of the discussion, that will be a major increment in terms of what we're talking about. So, if we wanted to get up to the protection, and I think it's exciting. If we got to 800 million people, that might mean doubling the World Service budget. Could we get even further than that? Because what we know is it's one of the most important things for the UK. It is one of the shining beacons of what we are, but it also does good. So that growth plan is what I really would like to see happen, which is beyond the kind of short term, can we make sure we've got a couple of years at this level of funding to survive?
Excellent, thank you very much. John.
I think we have sympathy with your frustration at the difficulty of planning in the long term with the uncertainty around your funding. But why do you think that transferring funding responsibility from a licence fee payer to the government is going to give you any more certainty? Surely at the moment it is likely that government and the competing pressures from other departments is going to give you even less certainty.
It's a very fair challenge. I think the key rationale for asking for that transfer is not about the certainty of time period. So that's not what it's trying to address. It's trying to address a fairness issue and also what the licence fee can deliver. It also, I think, in the other side of the budget of the licence fee is we're under enormous pressure. As you know, we've had 30% cut out since the last decade. We are working extremely hard against multi-billion / trillion-dollar entities to preserve public service broadcasting and deliver that value in the UK. Therefore, it's very hard to see a scenario. I take the point on whatever the charter length is. We won't jump the gun on that, but that gives some certainty. But it also puts it into a budget that is equally problematic in terms of its ability to drive revenue and preserve public service broadcasting. I think this is a UK strategic question. To your point, I think the government then can decide, and others, on what length of settlement, what level of certainty. The government is perfectly able to develop long-term projects and infrastructure and other things. We have to make a strategic call about the World Service, and I think that can be done within general taxation.
You've said it's a matter of principle, not just quantum, and it's a principle I have some sympathy with. But given the pressures on government expenditure, you are asking for the Foreign Office budget to take on a huge additional cost. Have you had any reason to think that the government might be sympathetic to this request?
Sympathetic, yes. The question that you made an assumption there that this is a discussion with the Foreign Office, but I think this is a governmental top level. We've got assembled 3 committees here. This is a strategic question for the UK, and just like we are properly interrogated around the efficiency of our spend, that we're loaded witnesses, but we would say that a proper investment in the World Service makes the cut. Now, I've got the point, and it's incredibly tough in terms of the framework in which public spending is working. We're deeply understanding of that. But if you're in my position, you look at the evidence set we have, I would challenge everyone to say, okay, are we spending money that efficiently across all our investments internationally? And I think that's an appropriate challenge from the World Service, because the other thing is I believe we've got data in terms of our return on investment and our efficiency that's pretty compelling. I mean, judge us on our numbers.
Ripper.
Hi both, and thank you, Tim, for that email I got via someone about the Wallace women, what to do with them. Thank you for that. I wanted to come back. You talked about being a shining beacon to these ideas of sort of independence and trust, and I know that the initials BBC throughout a lot of the globe are associated with the truth. You know, I know my cousins from the 80s in Bangladesh used to say, we listen to the BBC when we want the truth, and for them that is the World Service. So I just wondered, I mean, you have got this reputation as the most accurate independent news provider on the planet. What do you think the biggest threats are to your ability to maintain that? I mean, it sounds like you've mentioned AI, funding, there's a whole load of things.
Huge threats, and a very good question, huge threats.
Let me start by expanding a little bit on the point I made earlier about Russia and China.
Yes.
Because these are state actors, and there's a massive story going on right now about how the UK should handle China. These are state actors who are aggressive in their desire to dominate the global media landscape. And by being present in a country, they automatically increase their trust. We manage surveys which look at trust scores, and if you look at the trust scores, for example, in Egypt, where there's a lot of money being spent from Beijing and Moscow, the trust scores for those state organisations have gone up simply because they are more present than they used to be. So that is an existential threat to those of us who we believe trust should be based on impartial news and value-based journalism, not on propaganda. The marketplace is getting extremely congested, and it's getting congested with people who don't share our values. And this is an opportunity, we believe, in the discussion coming up around the Charter and around the funding, for the UK to make a statement about this. The BBC is the most trusted brand in the world, as you've mentioned in your question. We're also the most recognised UK export, way ahead of others that you might think would be very well recognised, and indeed they are. The Premier League, the Royal Family, but actually the BBC is more recognised than anything else this country exports. So to build out on that, there is an opportunity here for the UK to be the world leader, even more than we are already, in truth and impartial reporting and enriching the knowledge of communities around the world. And that takes you to international security, stability, democracy, all of those values that we're lucky enough to have in this country. And if the UK strategically believes that's a lever it wants to pull, there's only one way of pulling that lever, and that's to invest in the World Service. There's no other game in town for the UK to play with. And given that we are in a leading position for now in this space, we think this is a critical time to have this discussion as we run up to the next couple of years of funding.
Yeah, I've got mixed news. I mean, I think if you want cheering up before Christmas, our trust ratings actually improved this year, slightly in terms of the Reuters study. And we are the most trusted. Yeah, as a nation, we've got a public service broadcaster with the most trusted news service in the world. That's something. The trouble is, around us, as my colleague was saying, you're seeing trust ratings for RT and other Chinese services grow as they just take over more slots. And the other thing is we are facing a tsunami of bad actors, disinformation, fakery. The threats are overwhelming, and it is cognitive warfare, as it's been called, as people try and win the hearts and minds of populations and people around the world. And our current resources are impressive on their investment, but they need to be upweighted as per the earlier discussions. We're also doing work on things like, we may want to touch on AI that can help weed out AI for good, dare I say, disinformation, all those issues. But this is going to be ferocious. absolutely ferocious over the next few years. The final thing is, as editorially, we also have to hold firm and make sure we talk about impartiality and we deliver it, which I would say in a more weaponised world where everyone is trying to ascribe intent to the BBC, that it's a vehicle of government or it's a cabal of this, we have to make sure the people we recruit, the people we take on, have the strength and the resilience, and I thank them all for holding their nerve. Currently, 300 people working for the World Service, you may have heard this, are living in exile. They have made a choice to report without fear or favour, and that is the consequence. They can't visit their families in their home nation. That is pretty sobering, and the trend lines are not good, so they need support.
Yeah, I was going to ask on that actually, because also with Ukraine, with Gaza, it is the thing people turn to with the year of elections. I think 40% of the globe have been to the polls this year. People like Sarah Rainsford, Rupert Wingfield Hayes and John Sudworth, I think they've reported Eastern Europe, North Africa, Asia and North America, respectively. Is it the case, there's a thing in the Times that they've all been sort of ordered to concentrate on domestic work? I mean, is that a worry? Is that a sort of financial thing that's driving that? Because they've all been people that have been banned, or they've had, big restrictions put on in those countries they report from. So again, as you're saying, we need to look...
We'll just be really clear that there's zero...
They've been ejected from those countries before, or they've upset those countries. So that is, you were just saying, you are seen as independent of government, even though you're funded by them. So isn't that a worry? I think they've got 70 years of experience between them.
Yeah, and they're wonderful journalists, and they're supported by us, and they are extraordinary. There is zero link between us deploying what resources we need in what location to any of their histories around being expelled. I've never heard that, and that would not be something that we'd even countenance. What we have done is we have made some changes. So we set up a Warsaw office at one point, and we're saying we want to run out of Rome, but we're still going to be doing the domestic. I mean, our international provision from our UK based news operation is utterly critical. We'll have hundreds of people doing our work, and we have made some choices as we face some difficult budget situations in terms of just what resources where, and we can go into each the situations, but no, there's no drawing back from international reporting in any way, shape or form, and we've had discussions with, I won't go into all the individual cases because they're brilliant journalists and we need to support them.
Okay, and then just lastly, when sort of countries can switch off the internet, it happened in Bangladesh this summer, I mean, how do you get around that? That's another threat, isn't it? China, they can stop people looking at the BBC. I think Burundi's just banned your corporation.
Circumvention is really important. Getting around these blockages is something our technical teams work on all the time. But there's some really good news stories from around the world. We are not allowed to broadcast or transmit or upload in Iran, but we think about 13.5 million Iranians consume us on a weekly basis. That's a phenomenal audience for BBC Persian.
Through VPN or something?
Yes, and through a range of different methods, many of which are illegal and would we don't want to discuss in this forum for fairly obvious reasons.
We're at it this summer.
Of course. You're right about Niger have banned us because they didn't like some reporting that we did, which was factually completely true and absolutely robust journalism. But we would always rather do the story and take the consequences than not do the story. And we have many times run across the wrath of regimes around the world when we've exposed wrongdoing or corruption or persecution of minorities or whatever it might be. Our job is to keep doing that. And as managers, our job internally is then to manage the fallout from that and look after our staff. But we're not going to pull back from any of that journalism.
Okay, thanks. And I'm supposed to be going to Bangladesh next year. It'd be good to see the...
You'll be very welcome. Please let us know when you're in town.
Thank you,
You're very welcome.
John, did you want to pop in on this one?
Quick one. I mean, impartiality is as important for the World Service as it is for the BBC. Now, I don't underestimate the difficulty you face in reporting on very complex and controversial situations like the situation with Israel-Gaza. But you'll be aware that there have been a huge number of complaints about the coverage by BBC Arabic, with individual reporters being identified as having tweeted in support of Hamas, and with complaints upheld, something like 2/3 of complaints upheld. Are you satisfied with the impartiality of BBC Arabic, and will you do more to make sure that it is maintained?
Can I just split? So I might get Jonathan just talking to the governance of the services. I would say in my career, this has been the toughest to negotiate as as a conflict. We have obviously thousands of strong voices on either side. With regard to social media activity, I'll just take that, Jonathan, you may want to talk about more broadly about the service. There is no situation in which we don't follow up, put it through process and make decisions. I'm not going to go through all the outcomes of disciplinary process, but we act every time we see social media in this circumstance, and I think we're managing a very difficult circumstance pretty well, actually. And there have been circumstances where we've had to take tough disciplinary action. So in terms of the service itself, Jonathan, do you want to...
Yes, by all means. You're quite right about the polarising nature of this conflict, and it's now gone on for well over a year, as we all know and we've been reporting. I don't recognise the picture that's been painted by some of our critics about BBC Arabic. And in fact, we've had a significant number of complaints on both sides of this conflict, as I'm sure you will appreciate. Numerically, in fact, it's not far off even. I don't think that's necessarily a gauge in its own right, but it's not an unhelpful thing to bring into the room. In terms of complaints against Arabic, members of the committees might be familiar with the complaints process, which is overseen at the top level by an independent group called the ECU, the Executive Complaints Unit. They've dealt with 7, I think it might be 8 now, complaints, all of which have come from one source against BBC Arabic. None of those complaints have been upheld. So whilst it's important for us always to be open to critique, and we genuinely are, we've had several meetings with internal and external stakeholders on both sides of the divide on this story, and we will continue to engage with them when helpful. Any sort of shorthand summary that says there's been lots of complaints upheld is not actually fair on Arabic. And I do want to say that I think our journalists, both on location and in London, are doing a very, very difficult job, extremely skillfully. We would use this opportunity to ask again for the authorities in the region to allow us into Gaza so that we can report firsthand on what's happening, which is not currently possible.
Thanks, John. Uma.
Thank you both, especially for that last really clear answer. I will declare that I've actually been on BBC World Service, BBC Tamil, in both English and Tamil. I want to move back to the questions in relation to challenging disinformation. And you've both spoken to us about Russia and China and the amount of money that's going into it, in particular where our services, or BBC World Service, has been shut. And in some cases, the same frequency has been taken over by other states. In your view, does the government have a strong role to play in challenging disinformation overseas? And is BBC World Service the best vehicle to do this with?
I think to illustrate the point, first of all, let me just briefly touch on an example that some of you may have heard before, but I think it's worthwhile bringing into the room, which is Arabic FM in Lebanon, which I mentioned earlier in the session. We monitored their output on the day of the walkie-talkie explosions, and it was essentially Moscow propaganda. It was essentially telling audiences that the route to a more stable Middle East was stronger ties between Moscow and a range of capital cities around the Middle East. So it's for the Foreign Office and others to assess the dangers of that, but I think we'd all be concerned about that. Let's put it that way. Is the government a player? Yes, but the BBC is the subject matter expert in how to deliver impartial and free journalism around the world to our audiences with the network and the experience to do that. And for reasons that we discussed in response to colleagues' questions in the room in the last half an hour or so, we believe that's becoming an imperative battle. The battle for truth is on is a nice marketing slogan, but actually it's meaningful. It means that there is a moment in our modern history now when establishing what is true and what is not true is the preeminent role of media organisations so that consumers have a chance of getting to the truth. And we always say pursuing truth and enriching knowledge is our mission. Enriching knowledge implies to me that the knowledge that you are imparting needs to be based on fact and verifiably true. And that is something we hold dear to our services. So the government, of course, has a role. All governments in free democracies have a role. But in terms of the practical application of the discipline of journalism, the government are not the experts, and I don't think we claim to be the experts. That's what the BBC's done for 100 years, and we think we're in a very strong position to play a massive leading role in that. I mean, directly,
the BBC is a unique asset to deliver exactly what you're talking about. And it's all about trust. And the BBC is not perfect. We don't get everything right, but look at the trust scores. if I want cheering up, I almost go anywhere in the world and talk to people on the ground about what the BBC is. We're currently investing 137 million of government funding in this. We have to make a decision. But much as I would absolutely support the government's efforts in terms of fact-based sharing of facts and all the things the government does, at the end of the day, a trusted, impartial, editorially independent organisation is how to go about this, and we have it. We're unique worldwide. We're the most trusted news brand in the world. That is huge.
Thank you. Tim, I actually put one of your quotes to the Foreign Secretary recently. I said that, where you've said that the world is facing an all-out assault on the truth, and I explained the situation about BBC Arabic and Lebanon, and he said, if it's the case that the British language or the work of the BBC World Service are receding and other countries are stepping in, I'm afraid that I do not think we are living up to generations of the past. So with his thoughts in mind there, how have other countries who have international broadcasters, such as France and the US, sought to tackle disinformation and misinformation? And is there anything the BBC World Service could learn?
Yeah, there's always things we can learn. In fact, one of my meetings after we've finished in this session is with the outgoing editor-in-chief of Deutsche Welle, which is the nearest thing the German state has got to the BBC. It's not quite the same model, but all models are different around the world. They have language services in many territories, and we work cooperatively with them and others. So, for example, there are a couple of parts of the world where they've been banned operationally from working, where we do share some material in the public interest with Deutsche Welle. And we meet with others, Voice of America and the French, as you mentioned, and others from time to time to update ourselves on techniques and also political threats and dangers. So it is a cooperative environment. There's something about the footprint of most of these organisations which is quite historic. It's where those countries, in some cases, colonial history, for example. So we are much stronger, for example, in South Asia and in West Africa than some other organisations, and the same is true the other way around. So we don't feel that we're in direct competition with those organisations whose journalism we respect and we regard as being values-based. The competition is those organisations that are not imparting journalism of any particular quality. It is, however, important for us to say that we think it's a big selling point for the UK and the BBC that the BBC is the biggest operator in the world right now. That might not last very long at the current rate of spend from other places, but that is an important point.
My question wasn't on the competition, it was on are there any sort of good practice examples that we can learn from other broadcasters on how to tackle misinformation and disinformation?
I think it's fair to say that we are probably in the lead in this at the moment, and the conversations that I have with colleagues from other organisations tend to start with what is the BBC currently doing or thinking of doing. Of course, that doesn't mean to say that we don't have things to learn. I had a fascinating meeting relatively recently with colleagues from Voice of America. They are political appointees, and the cast list of senior leaders at Voice of America may well change now. There's been a change of power in Washington. But I would expect that conversation will continue to be cordial and constructive. I don't believe there's anyone else in the world who is technically more advanced than we are or is more dedicated to this than we are. But of course, that's a constructive conversation.
There's two things I'd say. One is we've got to, I think your question is extremely well put, and the answer is we could probably dig even deeper into. But it's quite a small cast list. It's Voice of America, some of the public service broadcasters, and I would say the collaboration between us is very, very significant. You know, we're talking about how we do fact-checking, provenance using AI, without sounding too, BBC waving the flag here. I think most of them look to the BBC for advice. We are seen as world leaders in this. Particularly things like editorial guidelines. I was in Kenya, I went to a community station, and they had the BBC editorial guidelines on the wall and said, we'll go as close to this. So it's beyond individuals, the BBC. It's actually robust process. Editorial guidelines, that holds up. And I think that is copied around the world a lot. What I would say is the state actors, they're more subtle than this. They're not trying to do hard news coverage. They're often just doing so-called softer program with a message. It is a long-term game. And I think the threats are not just who's running the news story. They are who they feel culturally connected to. And it's slightly deeper than just a head-on confrontation on who's running the news service. This is profound, and it lasts over decades in terms of what's being built against us here.
Thanks, Huma. Absam.
Thank you, Chair. That was an interesting final point you mentioned there in terms of culturally competent and culturally aware. So you mentioned countries that perhaps might be a challenge. There's conflicts there. How does the World Service work on humanitarian projects or humanitarian issues in areas where there are conflicts? You mentioned Afghanistan earlier. Also taking into account your last comments of cultural understanding in those particular areas, how would that come across?
Huge, big.
Massive point. On the cultural understanding point, as I mentioned earlier, we've spent a lot of energy in the last few years moving our services and our production, and therefore our recruitment, into the markets that they serve. So I was in Nigeria relatively recently, and we have 5 language services across Nigeria based jointly in Lagos and in Abuja. And we've done that split very deliberately because the cultures of those 2 cities are very different from each other. And the language services that emanate from those 2 cities cannot be brought into one place without losing the cultural connection that you rightly identify as being a priority. On the humanitarian point, first of all, we do a lot of news which isn't bombs and bullets and conflict. We do a lot of news, for example, in health and education. Whilst I was in Nigeria, I was looking at a team's work in education. They'd found a volunteer who was educating school children around Maiduguri, where there's been, as you know, a very, very unhappy history of school kidnapping. And the story that we told there was of a volunteer teacher who never went to a classroom because they feel vulnerable in a classroom. But she would just put the message out that she was going to be in a village hall on Tuesday morning and do a pop-up class for children. It was a wonderful story of human endeavour. Health is very important. We again, in the same part of the world, we did a significant amount of coverage about the recent outbreak of Mpox and the vaccination programme that was then rolled out by the United Nations and other organisations. And I'd also point to our colleagues in BBC Media Action, which are part of the BBC. They're not actually structurally part of the World Service, but we work very closely with them. I was meeting with them only yesterday about philanthropic entrepreneurs in Zambia, for example, who are engaged in an education programme for underprivileged children in that part of the world and who use local radio outreach. And we work closely with them on sharing content from around the continent, which is valuable education for those children. There are loads of such examples. We're very happy to do a brief about media action any time, but those are the sorts of things that we're very conscious are in our editorial agenda.
I mean, directly to your question, to build on what Jonathan's saying, Afghanistan, 23% of adults in Afghanistan come to our services. That's pretty extraordinary. And of course, what we're also doing is providing through DARS, the TV and radio series, it's educative, it's absolutely given a chance for girls often barred from formal education to learn. We're playing an incredible role there. I'm very proud of the teams.
How do you monitor the impact of that against the value of the funding that you received? So how do you monitor whether it's actually reaching the people that it needs to reach?
So it may be slightly counterintuitive, but it's possible to do audience surveys even in places like Afghanistan. The costs of DARS are not particularly significant in the grand scheme of the budget. The public value of it is one of the things I'm proudest of, that the BBC can educate girls in a country that's so difficult. Because we talk about impartiality a lot. Impartiality isn't balance. We don't need to be balanced about whether it's a good or bad thing for girls to have education in Afghanistan. It's plainly one of the biggest outrages in the world, that half the population is banned, not just from education, but from a civilised, open society in that country. So we have a role to play in that. We don't use those education programmes to deliver political messages. We use them to deliver what they should, which is education. Absolutely. Learning about the world, learning maths and learning about the world around them, climate or whatever. We are about to open up a similar programme for BBC Arabic, again, lessons for children, particularly girls who find getting education in places like Yemen very, very challenging and very difficult. That comes out of the funding envelope of BBC Arabic. It's not a significant marginal cost, and I believe it's incredible value for money.
How do you monitor that against censorship in some countries? So the work in Afghanistan, incredibly important. How do we ensure that censorship and the current regime might restrict women and girls from access to these particular programmes? What actual work is taking place to try and challenge?
Yeah. Well, first of all, censorship is something we come across in lots of parts of the world, usually through blocking of our signals or our downloads. And that's increasingly sophisticated depending on where you are in the world. I mentioned earlier about getting around that through technical means. In terms of DARS, we deliver it through a number of different methods, including partners who distribute for us in Afghanistan, and that partner broadcasters are critical to us in all markets. We have lots of partner broadcasters. We make a product which lasts X number of minutes. It forms part of the schedule of a broadcaster who has a mixed offer for their audiences. So that's absolutely crucial. We're very conscious that in some parts of the world, and I mentioned Iran earlier, it's a very serious offence to access some parts of the media, and the families of our Persian colleagues are regularly interrogated, and that's something that's very troubling. In North Korea, it's essentially you are, if you're caught consuming Western media, that is a deeply, deeply serious moment. Ultimately, that gives us a choice about whether to continue with those services, but we believe that the provision of the free media is a right that people have. It's a human right, and that's why we're not balanced about it. We're not impartial about whether people have the right to know. What they do with that knowledge is a matter for them, but the right to know is something which is deeply grounded in what the BBC stands for.
There's a couple of things here. One is, when we're in extreme situations, we're frankly trying to find ways of getting into a country, often through different ways, even the dark web, which is, I never thought I'd approve as Director General, going into Russia, so we just try and preserve access in those extreme scenarios. There are other scenarios where democracy is under threat, but actually the depth of brand connection to the BBC, actually we find a lot of regimes don't want to be seen to be throwing out the BBC, if I can be blunt. What they want to do is engage with us. And at that point, that gets interesting as well in terms of making sure we hold our editorial ground while delivering that. So look, I cannot speak highly enough of the people on the ground in some of these pressured environments to try and navigate that course. What you have seen is we're broadly holding our reach through all of this, but the threats of censorship are growing weekly.
My final question in relation to the DARS programme, does this rely on the Malala Foundation funding continuing, or would you be able to cost this?
I beg your pardon, on which funding continuing?
The Malala Foundation?
The philanthropic funding, no. All those contributions are extremely valuable, of course, and they're very helpful to us, but I think we're committed to DARS. It's such an important part of what we do.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Yes, thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Davie, you've talked about the unfairness of having to choose between cutting domestic services for viewers in the UK and cutting the World Service. Can you explain the context in which you're having to make these decisions?
Well, the context is my primary job is to make sure public service broadcasting in the UK is sustained, and to do that the underpinnings of the BBC are relatively simple, which is, do most households think they get good value from the £169 a year? And as we do our research, obviously we have incredibly important roles in informing, educating, entertaining, but what it comes down to is, do most households get that value? The market has changed so fundamentally, I don't need to tell you, in terms of the last 5 years, on the obvious front for starters, which is we no longer have fixed distribution, we have infinite distribution. Therefore, you can choose anything of an evening, or you can choose. Now, in that context, I have to ensure, in rapid inflation within pockets of what I'm delivering, such as some of our programming, that we can sustain delivering 30 plus dramas a year. We're not trying to be the biggest, but we are trying to make sure we can secure Wolf Hall, we can secure Gavin and Stacey for Christmas Day. That's important, as well as provide the incredible news services we do. But the whole thing works together as a package for your licence fee. The pressures on that budget, as others around very significant based on market inflation and all the other factors around us. It's as simple as we do act as a group and move money around. Often it can be very unpopular if we move money around within that frame. We have had a situation where we've had, as I said earlier, 30% of our money taken in a decade, at least we're now at inflation. That enables us to make some choices within that framework. My job is simply to make choices against that, to make sure that the public get not only what's unique about the BBC, but they get enough of it and it's relevant to them. Because no point in doing it in an echo chamber, if I may, or a small section of society. If you're in my job, you're totally passionate about universality. That's the game, not just making high-end stuff. It's also about making sure the whole of society is in the game. It's simple. We are really, steam's coming off our budget. We've taken nearly 2,000 people out of the BBC. We've cut the budgets. We cannot be in a position where anyone has protected status. And there is a particular problem here, and do not misread me. It's not because I don't care desperately about the World Service, that if you are someone in Perth or Plymouth and you've paid your licence fee, you get less direct value from those language services particularly. And also, the World Service, vast majority of World Service English is coming from international, consumption. That's the problem.
How close have you come to telling the government that you might have to close one or more of the World Service language services?
I would say most funding rounds we get to that point in the conversation.
And how likely is it that there will be further cuts to domestic BBC services to protect the licence fee contribution to the World Service?
Domestic BBC services?
Yeah.
You mean...
Yeah. Domestic programme.
Yeah, it depends what you mean by cuts, and I'm not being clever. What I'm trying to... We are now have an inflation settlement, okay? In order to provide the things that I talked about, whether it's drama or news, we have to build digital services. I'm having to invest to make sure iPlayer is competitive, or BBC Sounds, while maintaining my... So you will hear things get cut as we move money around the BBC. So the cuts are not solely just about what the government funding, they're also us as a leadership team saying if the BBC is going to maintain relevance, you can't just keep all the money sitting in every single pot, you've got to move it around. It's the same as any enterprise. So we will continue to move money around the BBC. Yeah. Currently we've moved about 700 million, I think, and we're going to move to about $1 billion of our spending, moving it to be more effective. And that is often not popular, by the way, but we are actually delivering good numbers of the BBC in the UK. What I can't do, and I'd love to do it, is I can't put hundreds of millions into the World Service, which I think is a smart investment. I just struggle to see that as a fair investment as part of the licence fee.
So what would you do with the money that you would keep if the government took back funding the World Service?
I think that's a good question. Firstly, I think the BBC is woefully underfunded per se, and that if you look at the long-term future of the BBC, you are going to have to need serious investment in terms of programming, digital infrastructure, all those things to ensure the BBC's health for the next period. So I think we're going to need that and some to ensure there's investment, because so much has been taken off the BBC. So that's the first thing I'd say. But I think that's a matter for government in the round in terms of how you spend that money and what you do with that saving.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Emily.
Mr. Munro, you told Broadcast Magazine that the reason that you were closing Hard Talk at the end of this financial year was because nobody listened to it. Where did you get that idea from?
First of all, I didn't say that. Actually, what I said
was... You've been misquoted by Broadcast Magazine.
Let me tell you what I said and the reason we're closing Hard Talk. Hard Talk is a production of the news channel. It's made as a television programme. It's made 3 episodes a week, 30 minutes or thereabouts each. The audio version of that does run on World Service English, but the costs of that reside in the news channel. So for reasons that we've been discussing during this session, with pressures on budgets, the news channel had some tough decisions to take. And one of the features of news channels globally, it's not a BBC issue it's an international issue with rolling news channels, particularly when you have a very busy news period as we've been living through this year. Audiences switch away from news channels when news channels run pre-recorded programmes and they move away from live news.
Although, of course, when it goes out on the news channel, it goes out at 12:30 in the morning and 4:30 in the morning. So there may not be a large number of people watching it at that stage in any event.
Well, that's, of course, simulcast around the world, so it's peak time.
But across the world, it's on the BBC World News Channel 4 times a day, 4 times a week, 3 times a day, where it gets a 70 million audience, and on the English language World Service Radio, where it's on 3 times a day, 3 days a week, where it gets 100 million people listening.
These are big numbers.
Big numbers.
You're right, they are big numbers, and we will ensure that the long-form interview, if you like, if 25, 30 minutes counts as a long-form interview compared to most news interviews that you hear on other output, that is alive and well at the BBC. We do lots of long-form interviews, not all of them under the Hard Talk brand. We interviewed Angela Merkel pretty recently. It was on BBC Two. We just did the incoming Secretary-General of NATO in long form, which was on the News Channel and on Newsnight. So the long-form interview is something we feel very strongly about, but the commitment to doing such a heavy schedule of them was a financial commitment the News Channel could no longer sustain.
So, I mean, it's right, isn't it, that the long-form interview that the BBC undertakes under Hard Talk means that people like Sudanese warlords or Serbian presidents or all kinds of people who would not normally be expected to be asked a lot of difficult questions over a long period get asked those questions by the BBC on a regular basis. Don't you think that when your boss says that the BBC should be a shining beacon of the UK that does good, that Hard Talk does exactly that?
Well, long-form interviews do that and will do that. Whether it's under that brand or not is a matter of how we identify the programme, brand the programme, which budget it comes out of, and so on. As far as the World Service is concerned, we will continue to ensure that long-form interviews are very much part of our
How
schedule.
regularly are we going to hear long-form interviews being done on the World Service if you get rid of Hard Talk at the end of this financial year?
Let me make 2 points on that. First of all, we've not done...
It won't be a regular programme that we've
not done. Yes, we've not done a full schedule rebuild for the post-Hard Talk period. We're in a consultation with our staff right now, which members of the committees will be aware is an important obligation that we have with our staff. So we haven't come forward with a specific schedule proposal. And it's
So you might replace Hard Talk with another programme that will come out regularly, as often as this, 3 days a week, 3 times a day. You'll have a programme going out as regularly as that, doing long-form interviews, following consultation with your staff.
There's not a huge amount to gain by putting a programme in that costs the same as the one we've just closed down. So we are going to make some changes. But there are lots...
So holding world leaders to account is going to not be able to be done as often by the BBC because of cuts.
No, I don't think that's fair. I think if you look at the range of interviews in Hard Talk, and Hard Talk, by the way, I should just say, is an excellent product. This is not about the quality of the product or the quality of the editorial line in the interview.
No, it's because you said no one listened to it.
But I didn't, well, as I've just explained, I didn't actually say that. Nobody is suggesting that world leaders who are rightly held to account by the BBC and others will not have that experience on the BBC. They will. And as I've just explained, the example of Merkel and Mark Rutte...
But they're one-offs. They weren't from a programme that will be going out regularly.
No, but we cleared schedule time on BBC Two to run them in peak time so that bigger audiences could see them. And, of course, they also ran across our global output. There's also a lot of interviews that we do, for example, for Radio 4, which don't find airtime on the World Service because the schedule is built differently, and we're going to change that. So relatively recently, former member of the House, Sir Nick Clegg, who is a very important player in social media, as you will all be aware, did Political Thinking with Nick Robinson. That is an interview of international significance, in my view, because Facebook is clearly an international platform.
I mean, I understand
but it's not getting on the World Service at the moment.
But these are domestic-facing programmes that you're going to put out on the World Service. What I'm asking, and I won't ask it again, but I'll ask that one more time. Will there be a programme on the World Service that will be international, facing outwards and holding world leaders to account in the way that Hard Talk does in the future?
There will be a programmes, plural maybe, who knows, which hold people to account, opinion formers, politicians, decision makers, industry leaders, entrepreneurs.
Don't you think I wonder if I could ask your boss this. Don't you think it's a sad day for the BBC today, for you to be losing perhaps the best news presenter and interviewer that the BBC has ever had, and that Michelle Hussein is leaving the BBC in order to go to Bloomberg to do a regular programme internationally that will be doing long-term interviews?
I don't want to obviously comment on the specific. I'm very sorry to see Michelle go.
Thank you, Emily. Finally, Paul.
I declare my interest as a member of the National Union of Journalists and as a former presenter of BBC Radio 4's Week in Westminster. And it's radio I'd like to ask you about, particularly the closure of BBC Arabic and BBC Persian radio services. Now, Mr. Munro, you talked about people living in the rubble of Gaza right now and not worrying about the access to a data package, but they do have access to radio services. When we had Fiona Crack of the World Service before our committee, we asked her about the closure of the Arabic radio service, and she said that with hindsight, it does not feel like a good decision. How can you make sure you make good decisions in future on this kind of subject?
Yeah, thank you for raising that, because first of all, I agree with Fiona. You won't be surprised to hear. I don't think that decision stood the test of time. That's not to say that the decision was taken with anything other than good motives at the time against extreme financial pressures. That savings round amounted to about £28.5 million of annual savings taken out of the World Service in 2022. So some difficult decisions had to be taken. As I've just explained in previous answers, we've sprung up radio services for Syria and some radio output for Gaza and Sudan because we were lacking the continuing platform that Arabic radio gave us. To answer your question about avoiding future decisions of that sort, I'd make 2 points. The first is that we have clearly learnt a lesson about the withdrawal from linear services where digital maturity isn't as established as we would like to be. I think it's important that we're honest about that and not to try to rewrite history. We would be in a different position if digital maturity was as established as we hoped it would be, but we're not. And that's clear. The second point is that part of the funding ask, to be blunt, is that we're not in this dilemma again. And £28.5 million out of the budget as it then was 3 years ago nearly, was a significant percentage that we had to pull out because it was the beginning of the licence freeze period. So the whole of the BBC, not just the World Service, but everybody, was asked to reduce their operating expenditure. Across the BBC, a lot of very difficult decisions were made, and it's the nature of any change programme that if you bring in dozens of changes, some of them are going to be things that you, with hindsight, don't think stood the test of time. And I think that's firmly where I am on Arabic radio.
One of the consequences of really squeezing this budget so hard is this thing we talked about, this area we talked about earlier, which is just simply linear transition. So if you're left behind in digital, the future looks bleak. But meanwhile, if you can't sustain your linear, so sometimes, frankly, all organisations and media organisations are struggling with this, but just that pace of change and getting that balance right, and with the hindsight of events as well, I think we reflect on that as my colleagues say, and say, with the hindsight, we kept keeping that linear service going for longer.
Can I ask you, Director General, was the FCDO made aware beforehand of that decision to withdraw radio services from BBC Arabic?
I think
it's our normal I wasn't in the management team at the time, but it's our normal practice to inform, but it's not actually an FCDO decision. It doesn't require FCDO sign-off because it's not the closure of a language service as such. It's the movement of one platform to another. My general approach to government is not to take government by surprise with these decisions, because I don't think that's fair. They're a major funder of the World Service. We'd like them to be a bigger funder of the World Service, as we just discussed. But I wasn't in the room for that particular...
Yeah, I just have to look back. My instinct would be, and is we tend to be appropriately sharing the implications of financial settlements. So, we usually go and do that.
Well, notwithstanding your editorial independence, it'd be interesting if you could write to us to let us know whether or not there was any feedback from the government about anticipation that decision and the impact of it. Whether there was any decision within government to say, you've consulted us, we think it's a bad idea, or actually go ahead, we think it's borderline one.
We'll clarify that for you.
One very final quick one.
Final question, thank you both. It very much relates to Paul's question on the impact of the disinformation and misinformation. Did you make this assessment prior to shutting BBC Arabic? And notwithstanding the answer about the FCDO, was the government informed in any way about the impact and these potential foreign state actors that could be moving into those frequencies?
First of all, just to be clear, I wasn't in those discussions, so I don't speak from personal knowledge, and we're happy to clarify that for the committee when we've looked in that in more detail. We would tend to inform the government about the reach loss, the projected reach loss of closing a platform, of how many hundreds of thousands or millions of people would come off the reach targets. It's not, strictly speaking, a consultation because we were not closing a whole language down. What the reaction was from the government at that time, I don't know, but we can certainly come back to you with some.
I think we should just clarify to you exactly where we're on that. I think normally it would be as exactly as been outlined. It would mainly be about reach. I think it would be very difficult to forecast who takes frequencies or not. That risk has got even more real since that time, actually.
Okay, thank you. If you could clarify that with us. And before we conclude, is there anything that you briefly wanted to add or say?
No, I think we've got points across.
In which case, Mr. Davie, will be seeing you again via just the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee alongside Samir Shah, the Chair, in February. So we look forward to seeing you again then. But thank you both for your time today. And we're going to pause very briefly to allow the government witnesses to come forward and Emily to take the chair.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Welcome back to the joint session of the Foreign Affairs, the Culture, Media and Sport Committee and the International Development Committee on the future of the BBC World Service. I think that it one can state the obvious, which is the fact that there are 3 select committees wanting to talk about the future of the World Service shows just how much a priority elected members of Parliament put on this particular issue. For our second panel today, we have ministers and officials from the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office and from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Thank you very much for coming. Can you introduce yourself? Perhaps if we begin on the left with Helen.
I'm Helen Martin. I'm the Deputy Director in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport with responsibility for the BBC.
I'm Stephanie Peacock. I'm the Media Minister and the Member of Parliament for Barnsley South.
I'm Jenny Chapman, Minister at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office with responsibility for soft power and the World Service.
And I'm Patricia Seex, the Deputy Director at the FCDO with responsibility for the World Service.
Very good. Perhaps if I just begin with perhaps a more general question, which is how does the World Service feed into the government's idea about soft power, and is it a priority area? Perhaps if I ask Steph Peacock first.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a huge part of our soft power across the world, and I'm sure Baroness Chapman can speak to some of the specifics on that. But certainly from my department's perspective, the World Service has a huge part to play in broadcasting across the world in, I think, 58 countries, 42 languages, the voice of Great Britain and our values, and has done for many years previously.
Baroness Chapman.
I mean, I think that's quite an important starting point to ask ourselves, why are we doing this? Because we are investing significant amounts of money in this, and the government is about to launch a Soft Power Council, which we can talk more about if that's of interest. I think the way I think about soft power is that it's what enables you to achieve your objectives without using force and without just sort of paying people to do what you want them to do. So you're using the assets we have, which can be Kew Gardens, the Premier League, the Royal Family. I would add from the North East, I would add snooker, brass bands, darts, whatever we have. And the World Service is such a critical part of how we convey our values around the world. And that's about truth, access to information, about democracy. And it's using soft power, this is not the World Service specifically, to enable us to get what we want. What do we want? We want improvements on climate change, we want economic growth for our country, and we want security. And those things, I would argue, actually the World Service has a great deal to contribute to those things in tackling misinformation and disinformation, providing reliable sources of information in places where 75% of the people who listen to the World Service live in places where you don't have good access to free media. So I think the World Service has a great deal to offer in terms of our ability to use soft power, where I think the UK probably hasn't been doing all that it can in recent years, is we've not been particularly strategic about how we think about soft power and how we deploy soft power. So I think I was very, very pleased to see that the committees are so interested in this. And I think it's probably long overdue, and parliamentarians really ought to have their say and have a proper chew over, if you like, of what we're doing in soft power. So I'm very looking forward to your report.
So I wondered if you could briefly tell us what the FCDO's role on the Soft Power Council is.
Yeah, I mean, we're just bringing it together. We've got, I think, sort of 25 to 30 people who've agreed to take part. It's quite broad-ranging, so it looks at culture, we've got film, TV, and there's sport. The rule of law, I think, is very important and sometimes overlooked. So we've got people who we think are going to be quite influential in their fields, but also are really sort of super connectors, so they can bring other people along with them. And the idea of it is that it advises government. It's a joint initiative between DCMS and FCDO.
But what's the FCDO? So sorry to interrupt you, but what's the FCDO's role in the Soft Power Council? What's
the FCDO's role? Well, David Lammy and Lisa Nandy will be jointly chairing the Soft Power Council, but we want to make sure that we harness those insights that those organisations and individuals have in advising us in our strategic decision making, but also so that we can make sure that I think that if you're heading up an organisation, that whether you want it to or not, whether it's one of your key drivers, is around soft power. And often, if you're hopefully, if you're a Premier League club, you're not thinking about soft power. You're thinking about keeping your business going and winning your next match. But whether you like it or not, you are part of Team UK, and you are promoting the United Kingdom around the world. So it matters that the head of the Premier League understands the global context, I would say. And so the FCDO, it's about making sure that that happens in the right way, and making sure that as a country, we are as strategic and coordinated as appropriate when we're thinking about where we want to be active in soft power in the future.
So I wonder, Steph Peacock, is there anything extra, given what Baroness Chapman has said, that you'd like to say about DCMS's role on the Soft Power Council?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, obviously it'll be jointly chaired between the two departments, and I think the Foreign Secretary said in front of your committee it is about getting greater bang for our buck, that we've got a huge amount of soft power, and a lot of that does fall into our department with the creative sectors and the sports sectors and so on. So obviously it's about greater coordination and bringing those different organisations and those huge assets together to really sell Team GB and Great Britain as a whole.
So what's going to be the role of the BBC World Service on the Soft Power Council?
Well, we have the BBC studios are going to be on the Soft Power Council itself. The World Service, you could argue that there's a good argument for the World Service being on the Soft Power Council, but then again, we need to make sure that the World Service is protected in terms of its independence. So at this stage, we feel that they won't have the World Service on the council itself, because in a sense the World Service is plugged in very well and I think they should be there because they'd be quite good at informing others about the global context, because they're as aware as anybody. But the BBC is certainly going to be there, and I think that's
it's difficult, isn't it? It's difficult to get it exactly right. No, I understand that. Abdesam, you've got some questions.
Thank you, Chair. So we mentioned the World Service there. In advancing the UK's foreign policy interests in relation to the World Service, how might you think that the BBC will deploy influence and advance foreign policy using the World Service?
I think we have to be quite careful about this, because I probably wouldn't use the term deploy when it comes to the World Service in this way, because the World Service is so trusted internationally, as I'm sure Tim Davie and Jonathan Munro have explained. And one of the reasons for that is because they can say truthfully that they are independent of government, and it's important that we don't do things either deliberately or inadvertently that could imply that they are a kind of arm of the state, or that they're doing things as directed by government. So the way I think about this is that I feel like it's my right to go to the BBC and say, I want you to do X, Y, Z in these places, and they've got every right to say, no, and to disagree and to fight back. And I think that's healthy, and I think that that's the right way to go about it. I don't think that we think of this as being, in terms of the World Service, about deployment of an asset into a particular country.
Do you think it might help in any area of UK foreign policy in relation to trade, international investment, or is the idea to keep those at arm's length?
I think it's really quite important that we keep them distinct. But, does it help in terms of investment, of people's desire to travel here, desire to study here, that they get a good impression of the UK, that our values as expressed through the World Service are positive, and I think it does. So I think those things happen, but they happen because the World Service is a trusted brand, and it's that trust that reflects well on the UK, rather than us trying to say to the World Service, we'd really like you to do some more activity on that would help develop business opportunities in South Africa or something like that. I think that would be a mistake. So I think we get the benefit because the World Service is such a trusted brand and it's associated with the UK.
Beyond the soft power, do you not think that there are any other benefits of the World Service?
There's huge, humanitarian benefits, without a doubt. I think that the work that they've done in Ukraine and identifying Russian war dead, and they're being the most reliable and accurate source of the number of Russian casualties, is hugely important, and in a sense that helps our security in the long run. The reason that other countries are investing so heavily in media and information is because it matters now more than it ever has in history what a population thinks and how they're inclined to vote and whether or not they protest.
Do you think our funding levels will affect our ability to play a stronger role in that field?
Well, I think we get incredible value for money, if I'm honest. I think that the investment we make in our World Service compared to what other nations are spending, and the status that the World Service has and the trust that it has compared to the investment we make, I think it's very good value for money.
Thank you, Chair.
Monica, I think you want to follow up.
Yes, please. While I understand that tension, do you not think that not having the BBC at the table in these soft power summits means that they lose their voice in a way in which they can promote UK soft power? And given what you've just rightly said, that investment into that by other countries means that they have influence, do we not underestimate, therefore, the BBC's influence? And just on that last point, we've just been told by Tim Davie that if funding stays at the current levels, BBC World Service will go into managed decline, which wouldn't be a good thing for the UK. So what do you think about that?
I mean, I think it would be a very bad thing for the UK, and the aim of all of this, the work that the FCDO is doing and later the Charter Review will be about making sure that the funding position is stabilised for the long term, so that we don't have this sort of annual round of kind of panic and having to make quick decisions. That's not good for government, and it's not fair on the taxpayer, and it's certainly not good for the BBC or the World Service. On the should they be at the table, I mean, let's see. I think there's good arguments either way. At the moment, we've come down on having BBC Studios there and having the BBC at the table in that guise. I don't have a particularly firm view about it. And if the committee has an opinion about that, I'd be really interested to hear what that is. But the reason that they're not is it's been made in order to not compromise or allow others to say that they've been compromised. And I think that's the right place for now, but these things are not ever fixed, and we will continue to be open to suggestions on it.
Thank you very much. Can I move on to Uma?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, panel. My question is to Baroness Chapman. We've seen that last year the BBC cut BBC Arabic, Persian and Hindi radio services, amongst others. A stark example is where they cut the service in Lebanon. Russian-backed media took over and were broadcasting on the state frequency. We've heard from Tim Davies talking about a tsunami of bad actors, and this is, I think he said it was cognitive warfare at the moment in terms of the disinformation that we're facing. How do you expect the cuts that BBC World Service has made to impact on the UK's influence with world leaders and the public abroad?
I was very concerned at the time that decision was made. Obviously, everyone knows we weren't in government at that point. And I think most people now looking at that and bearing in mind what's happened since do wonder whether that was in fact the right choice to make. But, the World Service is one of the good things about the World Service is its agility. It's constantly changing. If it wasn't like that, it would still be broadcasting in Asia and Africa and the Caribbean in English, calling itself the Empire Service, or in the 40s it had a Danish service, and so it changes all the time. Some of those changes, I think it's allowed to make mistakes, but I do think that we need to tread incredibly carefully, and I believe that the experience of what's happened with the Arabic service it means that in future we need to be thinking, yes, but what if the situation changes on the ground? What if there's more instability? What if the projections of digital growth don't turn out to be as we expect for whatever reason? I think it has forced us to ask many more questions, and perhaps to challenge the World Service when they want to have those conversations next time.
Thank you. And in terms of explore on the soft power aspect of this, we've talked about the royal family, we've talked about sports, we've talked about lots of other exports. What alternative is there to BBC World Service in terms of a comparable soft power export?
I mean, I don't think there is one. I think what they do is so special and the quality is so good. I mean, yes, there are other news providers. CNN scores quite highly on trust as well, but actually I think that it's because they've been doing it for so long and the standards are so high and they have that independence from government, that gives them a real special role. So I think that it's those things that whatever else we do around funding and all that stuff, whatever else we do, that's what needs to be protected, because you can easily lose your leading position. The BBC World Service has no God-given right to have that position, and I think if that should be lost, that damages them, but it damages us as a country as well.
Thank you. My final question, just thinking about the services that we've already seen cut, and we've had today, you know, the value of hindsight, where some services have been lost and once they're gone, they can't come back. I'm thinking of you know, active situations at the moment where people are reliant on BBC World Service, or it's that impartial source of trusted news, particularly thinking of Sudan. We know the population there listen to BBC because no one else is consistently providing reliable information. How are the FCDO and others rebuilding relations with countries where our BBC World Service has been cut? Because it was a two-way flow of info there. We're trusted partners there, and now we don't exist. What's the FCDO doing to mitigate that?
I mean, I haven't come across situations where we've had an issue where the World Service is withdrawn entirely. I think it's important to remember the Arabic service was just radio, and the digital and the TV have continued, and they've managed with their crisis operation to be, you know, 700,000 people in Gaza every week. It's pretty impressive, actually. So I think that, you know, it is part of, it's an important diplomatic tool in that sense, I guess, is what you're asking. Sort of, does withdrawing from a country causes a diplomatic issue? Not since I've been in role that I'm aware of have we had that as a problem. I think more of our concern is about making sure that people who are subject to misinformation or who lack ability to get accurate broadcast news are able to get it, because we see that it's a, you know, we spend our ODA money on this. It's important, you know, it's a SDG goal that people have access to accurate information and freedom of information. It really is important. So those are the things that worry me when we're discussing perhaps standing down a platform.
Thank you very much. John.
In 2015, the government partially reversed the decision taken in 2010 when the Foreign Office gave an additional top-up to the licence fee funding, with the specific suggestion that it should be used to broadcast language services in particular areas of the world where it was felt we needed to do more. You've now given an additional sum of money, and you've also just said that you think it's fine for you to suggest to the BBC World Service things they might do, although it's their right to come back and oppose that. Can you tell us, as part of the new funding, have you said to the BBC World Service, we're going to give you more money and this is where we think you should devote it, and have the BBC agreed to that?
What we've said on the additional 32 million was that they must maintain the 42 languages, and this is important, that they must maintain the crisis response, because that is something that I think, well, Syria, it's already been proved to have been essential. So that's what we've said at this stage.
And had the BBC said to you that unless they had that top-up, they wouldn't?
I think it's pretty obvious the situation that they were in, that unless there was additional funding, you know, it's not a case that they make a threat and we respond to the threat. I think we need to get to a point where there's sort of maturity of engagement, where we're quite open, and we could see for ourselves that the funding predicament was such that had that additional resource not been available, they would have to make some pretty unpalatable decisions, and we had provided that additional funding because we wanted to make sure that that was going to be avoided.
I mean, your request to them that they maintain 42 language services and the crisis provision is a sort of fairly basic one. Do you see it as appropriate and possible that the Foreign Office may come back in due course and say, and actually we'd like you to devote a bit more to this part of the world because we see that is where the need is greater?
I mean, I think that the Foreign Office ought to do that if that's what we think is needed. I think that's entirely fair, but I think we need to have a kind of relationship where we can explain why that is, and the BBC can explain its constraints, and we can have a conversation about it. My strong sense from the BBC, especially given the predicament that they faced in recent years, if I can put it that way, but they've remained so committed to providing this service in the way that they have and to the standard that they have. I think that there's no, it shouldn't be a fractious relationship. It should be one where, yes, there are tensions, and, I might want them to do things that they don't really, because I'm not a broadcaster. I don't know necessarily what how accurate the projections are for digital take-up are in a particular country. They will know better than me. So there needs to be an exchange of opinion in that way. And I think that's the kind of relationship that we're seeking to build with the BBC on this.
And so how often do you have conversations with the World Service about?
Well, so we have to have our annual review of their objectives, priorities and targets, which we did a few weeks ago. But I think if that's all you do, then that's pretty poor. So I think Jonathan Munro's been in the Foreign Office to see me recently. Went to Broadcasting House to meet some of the production staff and see the studios. But I think it needs to be. It shouldn't be an informal situation. It must be formalised. But I think that just having one session once a year in front of a spreadsheet, I think we can probably do a bit better than that.
Thank you very much. We want to move on to the short-term funding budget uplift. We'll go to Rupert.
Thanks. Thank you both. And Baroness Chapman, as you now are. There was a lot of love for you at our committee, just the CMS people, when we met on the 19th of November. Rupert. For the uplift that you got, the cash injection. So I wanted to ask, in a time of black holes and straitened circumstances and Iron Chancellor, what arguments did you make to get this extra boost of 32.6 billion? Million, sorry, for the next... yes. What was it that succeeded where others...
Well, I think the argument makes itself. And, I do know... our Chancellor, and she's not a soft touch by any means, and you can see that by some of the tough decisions that she's had to make. But the way that the World Service contributes to our objectives as a country, and I think for me the security priority, but also informing people around climate and climate change. We've seen some really good examples of what they've been able to do. There was something about in Indonesia where they've been able to promote recycling and retrieving plastics from the sea because of information that they were able to share, which is it wasn't a campaign, it was journalism where they were highlighting some work that had been going on there. It supports our objectives as a country. And so I think that the Treasury could see that, they could see the good value for money that it provides, and they could see the crisis response in Gaza, they could see what was going on in Sudan. And if you didn't, and educating women and girls in Afghanistan, and those are whole government objectives. Those are not just things the Foreign Office cares about. These are things that the whole government has a stake in. And
to Stephanie Peacock, similar sort of question. What arguments were the CMS ones that were advanced to get this extra cash?
Well, of course, the short-term settlement or shorter-term settlement, as Baroness Chapman has outlined, was a negotiation between the Foreign Office and the Treasury, but we work closely with the Treasury, with the Foreign Office, and obviously we meet regularly with the BBC, as a whole. I think in terms of the short to medium term, we'll have the second spending review. I think the longer-term funding of the World Service is obviously something that we will want to explore as part of the Charter Review, and although that doesn't come until 2027, it's a long process, and we will begin that in the coming weeks and months. And as part of the Charter Review, we really want to have that national conversation about the BBC in its entirety, about what it's for, who it serves, and the World Service is a huge part of that discussion.
Okay, I think the long term is in the next question.
Very good.
Yes, I'd like to ask you about the long term. Baroness Chapman, you told the Lords last month it was a mistake to put that burden for the World Service entirely on the licence fee payer. And you said you were open to future funding models. Do you accept that the current hybrid funding model is unsustainable?
I love it when people actually take notice of what you say in the Lords. I am quite aware that this would be massively putting my tanks on Steph's lawn. So I think it's, I think Steph needs, Minister Peacock needs to talk about the sort of long-term model. I think most people, even people who were involved in the decision to put the burden entirely on the licence fee payer, probably quite quickly came to recognise that that really wasn't the wisest thing that could have happened, looking at John, because so quickly, you know, it became obvious that there was going to be some additional funding needed, and you know, we're in a situation now where around a third of the funding comes from the Foreign Commonwealth Office, and you know, a large
given
chunk
that the
of
money does come
ODA.
from the FCDO rather than from CMS, do you accept that the current hybrid model is unsustainable?
I'm trying not to get hung up on funding and where the money... It's all taxpayers' money, right? So it needs to be really... What matters to me is that we get high-quality product and good value for money, and that we do it for, you know, as efficiently as we can. Is the way we do it at the moment, where you've got some things ring-fest for grants, some things licence fee payer, you know, there is, and all the sort of inefficiencies that you can kind of create yourself inadvertently. Is that the best way of doing it? You know, I'm interested in what the committee has to say about that. But actually, in terms of charter review and how the World Service fits in the sort of bigger questions about licence fee and all of those things, it's definitely not my question to answer.
And see the brilliantly advised Minister Peacock wants to step in right now.
I'm happy to step in, yeah. I don't want to misquote the Secretary of State, but I believe she was in front of the committee last week, and I think she used the words around increasingly unsustainable. I think we all recognise that over the last 10 to 15 years, the BBC has had a very challenging funding situation. Depending on what estimate you look, it's a 30 to 40% cut, as I think was quoted in the previous session. I think what we all want to get to, the position where we all want to get to for the World Service, but of course for the BBC as a whole, is a sustainable funding model, and that's a really important question, and it isn't an easy question in the sort of changing nature, the rapidly developing media landscape, of course. And the Charter Review, as she said, no option is off the table in terms of funding, and we'll have an opportunity to debate that further in the House, both later today and indeed tomorrow in Westminster Hall. But Charter Review, it's a long process. It's about involving stakeholders. This committee will play a big role, Parliament, and also the public. We want that to be a genuine national conversation, and the Lisa Nandy, the Secretary of State, has talked about a settlement not just for the next 10 years but for the next 50 years, and I think that's a really important viewpoint.
I totally get the point about the Charter Review, but this is specifically an inquiry into World Service funding. That's why I was directing it at Baroness Chapman, but the chair, my own chair, may now have a question on longer term funding as well.
Yeah, so can I ask Minister Peacock, are you working on the assumption that the funding of the BBC World Service will come in under the Charter Review then?
We're not assuming, in terms of how we look at the funding of the World Service, we are assuming that the longer term funding of the World Service will be considered as part of Charter Review. However, I do appreciate, and this point has been put to me by the World Service and others, that is ultimately 2.5 years away. So in terms of the short term funding, or the short to medium term, I think that will be addressed by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office with the Treasury as part of the second spending review. So we're not delaying everything to the Charter Review, but in terms of the point of principle, should it be government funded or not, I think that has to be considered as part of the Charter Review.
Okay, so what's the plan in the meantime then to stop the BBC World Service getting to a point where it has to turn around to you and say they're going to have to cut one of their language services?
That would be a conversation I think we would have between the Foreign Office and the Treasury, and of course we do have the second spending review coming up.
Yeah, did you want to...
I guess that's the situation we're trying to get away from, isn't it? Is to get one where we don't have to have these annual rounds, and so that the World Service can plan more effectively. I like what the World Service is doing in terms of moving its production capacity in country, because I think it's better value for money. It's also you're going to get a more country-specific product doing it that way. I think that's a really good thing. That takes planning. You know, it's moving people, it's moving buildings, it's something that needs to be done with a long-term focus. At the moment, in some places it's difficult for the World Service to do that as well as it could. So the situation you're describing is one that we want to get away from. We're probably stuck there for a little while longer, But what we've just achieved with the spending review we've just gone through, I think should give us all confidence that the government is committed to making sure that the World Service is sustainable, and that we don't end up with having to make... I think cutting language services can be the right decision. What we don't want to see is language services that we really treasure and we want to see continue having to be lost because of funding decisions. We'd like to avoid that if at all possible, but that doesn't mean that the World Service can't change its, it ought to be able to be flexible. It ought to be able to deprioritise and prioritise new parts of the world. That's been its way it's operated for 90 odd years, and I think that, so, am I saying we won't see any language cuts? I'm not saying that, but I think what we need to do is make sure that when those decisions are made, they're made for the right reasons.
Very briefly, Chair, one final question. Do you think, so your licence fee payers are also taxpayers?
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. But do you think licence fee payers know that they're funding the World Service? And do you think that they mind? Because there was when we had Tim Davie before us a moment ago, he was talking about any money you spend on World Service is money that you're not spending on, domestic telly or radio or digital. Do you think viewers, licence fee payers in the UK care? Are they interested in that? Do they mind?
This is an evidence-free answer, I think. I was, lived in Darlington and represented it for 10 years, and I can tell you for now that, honestly, no one ever mentioned the World Service to me once. So do they care and do they... I honestly don't know if they mind. I don't think awareness is probably all that great, if I'm honest. They're probably not that pleased about paying the licence fee at all. So I don't know. And I think that but I do think that to put the entire burden of this onto the licence fee payer, I think that has been proven to have not been the wisest and most secure decision to have made. How licence fee payers feel about that is a question probably for people who do lots of research into this, and that's not the Foreign Office.
Is it a question that will be taken into consideration at the point of the Charter review?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely, and I think it's hard to tell. If I was to ask my constituents in Barnsley if they listen to the World Service, I would suspect they would say not. However, if I was to talk to them about some of the motivators, some of the reasons behind the World Service that this committee has been exploring, and the huge contribution it makes to the security of the UK, I think they absolutely would be supportive of that, and I think that's really, really important. And so I think this is an issue that does need to be explored at Charter Review, because we can't escape the fact that this is the model we've currently got, that we've inherited from the previous government, and the Charter Review does give us an opportunity to explore these challenges.
Thank you.
That's really interesting answers. Can we move on to the humanitarian impact of the World Service? Monica.
Thank you. This is a question to Baroness Chapman. On the contribution of the World Service to humanitarian impact, do you think the World Service's reporting on conflict zones affect the local population's access to life-saving information and aid, such as in Gaza and Sudan?
Do I think the reporting, does it help the local population's access to life-saving aid and information? Without a doubt, yes. There are so many examples of this. I think one that has really struck with me was that the BBC were able to detect changes in the colour of the sea around Gaza, and were one of the first people to say we think that there's a major contamination issue here, and to preempt the polio situation. So, there are some very real, very hard examples of where access to information and where the use of the tools that the BBC has have led to real-world consequences.
And does the World Service collaborate with other international organisations and NGOs to support humanitarian efforts?
I don't know. I think that's more of an operational question. So I think that's probably something that they would need to, unless Patricia, No, I'm afraid I don't know. I would expect that they would work with NGOs in country as appropriate, but I honestly don't know any examples of it.
Okay, and the impact of cuts to the World Service language services, has that impacted its ability to reach those in crisis in countries such as those we've talked of?
Well, I think one of the reasons we look at the Arabic radio decision and we think, was that really in hindsight? If we'd known then what we know now, would that decision have been made? No, it wouldn't, because actually people's access to radio became more and more important. So the answer to your question, I think, straightforwardly is yes.
Okay. So collaboratively, then the value of the World Service to humanitarian aid in the world is valued by the FCDO?
Very much so, yes.
Thank you.
Ryan.
Thank you, and I better start by declaring my interest as one of the founders of Radio for a Better World. So, Baroness Chapman, in what ways does the World Service help amplify the voices of the marginalised or vulnerable communities during humanitarian crises?
And there are examples where they will report on killings, and they will report on incidents that have not been covered by the state media where they are. Sometimes that has a very real consequence for those journalists. And sometimes the World Service has been able to make sure that crimes get investigated because they have highlighted them. I think in the future we may well find, if it hasn't happened already, but some of the investigative work that is done by journalists in countries later used to assist with investigations of a more criminal nature. So I think sometimes they are the only people present doing that kind of work. So, I think it's vital.
And how does the World Service engage with local communities to ensure that coverage is relevant and beneficial to them, for example, through its educational content?
Again, I think I would be overstepping sort of the limits of my knowledge on this. Is more of an operational question. But I think that when you're talking about the work that they do on education, that's done necessarily with knowledge and insight from the local population. Otherwise, it wouldn't be relevant or effective or impactful. And the fact that you have 23% of people in Afghanistan accessing the service, I think tells you that the World Service is getting that right, and that they are managing to get the content as appropriate and delivered in the way that does seem to be relevant to the community that they seek to target.
I can probe with one more question, which is what mechanisms are in place for local audiences to provide feedback on programming, and how is this feedback used to shape future content?
There is a complaints procedure, if that's what you mean. I don't know the detail of that.
I can come in on that. It speaks to feedback, but in terms of complaints, there is, of course, the BBC First Service, and then if you complain to the BBC, you can then escalate it to the Executive Complaints Unit, which I think the detail was run through in your previous session with the BBC. So audiences who aren't happy can certainly feedback in that way.
And how about if they are happy?
If they are happy, that's a very good question, one which I will ask the BBC and write to the committee about.
Thank you. It'd be nice to know.
Before we move on, some of the questions were difficult for Baroness to be able to answer, and I just wondered if Patricia Seex is able to help with answers to any of the questions.
I think we could write with some good examples in response to your into your question and to your question. If that.
I think that would be really helpful. Thank you so much. Okay, so Alice, I think you've got some questions.
I'll come on to the kind of withdrawal of services process. I just wanted to ask, we heard from the BBC earlier that obviously Syria, when a crisis happens, they have to move money around within their budgets to be able to cover some of that. Obviously, we've just announced £50 million package for Syria. Is there and I recognise that as for urgent humanitarian need, but we've heard obviously in terms of the value of information, in terms of accessing that and tackling disinformation. Is there ever a discussion, or has there been within these aid packages, about potentially extra emergency funding for the World Service when they're having to move their money around to deal with different conflicts?
I can imagine a situation where there would need to be. We haven't faced that yet because the World Service does keep this crisis fund there specifically. Unfortunately, it's always needed it. So it's not, it's not a conversation we've had to have as yet. But I think, given just how important access to information is now more than ever, I think I can anticipate a situation where we would need to have that conversation, but we're not in that position.
I haven't come to you and asked you that.
I see Patricia.
Well, just to say that the funding agreement for 25-26 shifts the responsibility for that crisis pop-up fund from licence fee to us substantially.
Okay. So just moving on, and we raised this question earlier, and I appreciate that Baroness Chapman, you weren't there at the time, and neither was, I think, Mr. Munro and Mr. Davie. But just going back to the decisions around withdrawal of services that we've referred to earlier, and maybe Patricia, you can answer these, you might have been there at the time. Is there a kind of protocol around how the FCDO is engaged in any of discussions around withdrawal of services? And I know the BBC is going to write to us in terms of that, but if you can remember, Patricia, maybe in that example in the past, what actually happened in terms of FCDO engagement would be helpful.
I wasn't there at the time, but it's really...
Yeah, I mean, the agreement is that in terms of, if they were to withdraw a whole language service, that we would be able to direct, or we'd have purchase on that. But in terms of platform, that's seen as an operational decision for the BBC. So Arabic, it was the radio that they withdrew, not a whole language service. So as far as the sort of formal agreement goes, the government, as I understand it, wouldn't have been able to direct the BBC to not make that choice. Now, would a different government or a different set of circumstances been able to use stronger arguments or shown more engagement and got to a different outcome? I don't know. But were the BBC to make that decision again today, the government doesn't have the power to be able to just simply direct the BBC to keep that service alive because they haven't withdrawn the entire language provision.
And would you just, and I appreciate some of this would be for the World Service, but in terms of performing any long-term impact assessments of the withdrawal of that, is that fully a decision for the World Service, or would the FCDO kind of be pushing for that, particularly when it's taxpayers' owed money that is in question?
Yeah, I mean, as part of our annual discussion, which I've only done one of these, we look at their targets, and a lot of it, I mean, there's a question about whether too much of it actually is about reach. And so if reach has been affected by the withdrawal of a platform, then we would be able to challenge them on that and say, what are you going to do about this? As it happens, it would appear that reach in that area hasn't really fallen because they've done the pop-up service and because there's been a stronger move to digital for other people accessing the Arabic service. So it's slightly more complicated, I think, than we sometimes reflect in our conversations.
Very good. We're going to move on to countering disinformation, which is something that as the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, we've been kind of hitting our head against a lot recently. And Uma's going to lead, but there may be other questions, particularly from the Foreign Affairs team.
Thank you. I'll go back to Baroness Chapman, if I may. You mentioned that in your previous answer that it was a decision for the BBC to make some of these strategic operational decisions. Tim Davies, in his answer to us just before this session, actually mentioned that some of this is a strategic discussion and decision for the UK. So I think there's probably a discussion to be had between the government and the BBC on who makes what decision when, because there seems to be differing answers.
Well, can I just, I think hopefully I cleared some of that up with my answer to the last question, which is, I think there is clarity. Whether the clarity is right and whether we want the clarity to stay the same in the future, I'm interested in your view. But we do have the power to direct the BBC to close a language, not close a language, that kind of thing. We do not have the power to determine whether or not it withdraws from digital or television or radio, but keeps the language there. So,
do you think the government should have that decision?
I
knowing what we know now, especially about BBC Arabic, because we did ask them if the BBC made any assessment on the impact of closing these services, especially with misinformation and disinformation, and was the government informed? And we weren't given too clear an answer.
So what I would expect if it was happening now is that we would be informed, absolutely. We wouldn't have the power to direct the BBC to change its choice, but I think it would be absolutely legitimate and my duty to point out to the BBC any concerns that we might have, or to say, look, you do that, but the global context as we see it means that the effect will be X, Y, Z. So I think that is a grey area. Do I think that that's where the right... I don't know yet. Ask me in another year whether I think the line's in the right place.
Isn't one of the problems, though, that so much disinformation comes from states, hostile states, and so we may be attacked, or our allies or other countries may be being attacked through disinformation put out by... And what is the state response? What is the state defence? And I think that's kind of one of the questions that we're wrestling with. Yeah,
and I think, do we keep a service going on radio in particular in a place that we know that broadcast space is contested or competitive, when we know we're not getting much reach out of it, but we also know that if we withdraw, then there'll be a Russian channel there in its place. What's the right answer to that? So at the moment we're saying to the BBC, we judge you on reach. So can we be surprised when the BBC makes decisions that enhance reach above other issues? Or should we be saying to the BBC, we'd like you to consider these other issues as well? That, I think, is a live question, and it's one at the moment that we resolve through dialogue with the BBC, but in the future we may wish to reappraise the set of sort of metrics that we assess the BBC on.
One follow-up, thank you, that was really clear. We know now that disinformation and misinformation is one of the biggest challenges ahead for us, especially with our national security. It's a demonstrable national security threat. Will future funding decisions for the BBC take this into account? Because this is new. This is not perhaps what we would have looked at 10 years ago or 5 years ago. So is there a mechanism for it? And if there isn't, will we consider that going forward?
I mean, I would say that what we've just seen as part of the recent spending review, where we've secured the uplift, reflected just that concern. This is something that, in fairness to the previous government, it probably didn't have to be as worried about in 2015. But, we sure as hell ought to be worried about it now.
Thank you.
Well, really, I just want to get to the last question, which is about perception and protecting the reputation of the World Service. I wondered if you would commit to safeguarding the World Service, and if necessary, enhancing it for the purposes of upholding democratic values, for the purposes of ensuring that we have resilience overseas. How important is it?
I mean, I'd be very proud to say yes to that.
Good.
Because I think you can tell from the answers I've given that I feel quite strongly about it.
Yeah, I completely echo that. As we've said from the right beginning of this session, it's a huge asset to the country, not just power, but the huge contribution it makes. And we've talked about all of that this afternoon: humanitarian education, the accuracy of information, the huge contribution it makes to the security of this country. I think we all want to see it thrive, and we all want to see it on a sustainable footing for the future.
And there have been political attacks on the BBC that have been going on, and perhaps it's it's evidence of its very power. We were looking earlier at news reports from Niger about attacks on the BBC there, and one of the attacks is alleged government interference. People will be surprised at how it is that we wrestle with this issue in the way that we have, but it has damaged the reputation of the BBC overseas and audience trust. So. Can the government take any steps to strengthen the standing of the World Service abroad?
I'm aware of what's happened in Niger, and I think it's deeply regrettable. Obviously, the BBC takes these issues incredibly seriously, and of course the safety of their journalists, and they'll be making sure that their team are okay. But I think the best thing that the government can do in terms of protecting the reputation, the biggest threat in a way, is any perception that the World Service is somehow a propaganda arm of the government. And that if we start playing that game, then we will weaken the World Service, there's no doubt. So I think that we need to just be mindful at all times in every decision we make, whether that's about funding or commentary that we might choose to offer, that we are respectful and that we value the editorial and operational independence of the World Service at all times.
So Peacock, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think Baroness Chapman has articulated it very well. I think it's absolutely right. We need to be respectful, we need to respect the independence, and we want to see it thrive into the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That concludes our joint session on the future of the BBC World Service. Thank you to all our witnesses for their time this afternoon. And if there are any additional points and you're able to write to us, we would be very grateful if we could have those as well. Order.